Agatha Christie, Death on the Nile, short story. Lady Grail was nervous. From the moment of coming on board the SS Fayum, she complained of everything. She did not like her cabin. She could bear the morning sun, but not the afternoon sun. Pamela Grail, her niece, obligingly gave up her cabin on the other side. Lady Grail accepted it grudgingly. She snapped at Miss Macnaughton, a nurse, for having given her the wrong scarf and for having packed her little pillow instead of leaving it out. She snapped at her husband, Sir George, for having just bought her the wrong string of beads. It was lapis she wanted, not carnelian. George was a fool. Sir George said anxiously, "Sorry, me dear, sorry. I'll go back and change, Plenty of time." She did not snap at Basil West, her husband's private secretary, because nobody ever snapped at Basil. His smile disarmed you before you began. But the worst of it fell assuredly to the dragoman, an imposing and richly dressed personage whom nothing could disturb. When Lady Grail caught sight of a stranger in a basket chair and realized that he was a fellow passenger, the vials of her wrath were poured out like water. "They told me distinctly at the office that we were the only passengers. It was the end of the season and there was no one else going." "That right, lady," said Mohammed calmly. "Just you and party and one gentleman, that's all. But I was told that there would be only ourselves." "That quite right, lady." "It's not all right." "It was a lie." "What is that man doing there?" "He come later, lady. After you take tickets. He only decide come this morning. It's an absolute swindle." "That all right, lady, him very quiet gentleman, very nice, very quiet." "You're a fool. You know nothing about it." "Miss Macnaughton, where are you?" "Oh, there you are. I've repeatedly asked you to stay near me. I might feel faint. Help me to my cabin and give me an aspirin, and don't let Mohammed come near me. He keeps on saying, 'That right, lady,' till I feel I could scream." Miss Macnaughton proffered an arm without a word. She was a tall woman of about 35, handsome in a quiet, dark way. She settled Lady Grail in the cabin, propped her up with cushions, administered an aspirin, and listened to the thin flow of complaint. Lady Grail was 48. She had suffered since she was 16 from the complaint of having too much money. She had married that impoverished baronet, Sir George Grail, 10 years before. She was a big woman, not bad-looking as regarded features, but her face was fretful and lined, and the lavish makeup she applied only accentuated the blemishes of time and temper. Her hair had been in turn platinum blonde and henna red, and was looking tired in consequence. She was overdressed and wore too much jewelry. "Tell Sir George," she finished, while the silent Miss Macnaughton waited with an expressionless face, "tell Sir George that he must get that man off the boat. I must have privacy. All I've gone through lately she shut her eyes. "Yes, Lady Grail," said Miss Macnaughton, and left the cabin. The offending last-minute passenger was still sitting in the deck chair. He had his back to Luxor and was staring out across the Nile to where the distant hills showed golden above a line of dark green. Miss Macnaughton gave him a swift, appraising glance as she passed. She found Sir George in the lounge. He was holding a string of beads in his hand and looking at it doubtfully. "Tell me, Miss Macnaughton, do you think these will be all right?" Miss Macnaughton gave a swift glance at the lapis. "Very nice indeed," she said. "You think Lady Grail will be pleased, eh?" "Oh, no, I shouldn't say that, Sir George. You see, nothing would please her. That's the real truth of it. By the way, she sent me with a message to you. She wants you to get rid of this extra passenger." Sir George's jaw dropped. "How can I? What could I say to the fellow?" "Of course you can't." Elsie Macnaughton's voice was brisk and kindly. "Just say there was nothing to be done. She added encouragingly, "It will be all right." "You think it will, eh?" His face was ludicrously pathetic. Elsie MacNaughton's voice was still kinder as she said, "You really must not take these things to heart, Sir George. It's just health, you know. Don't take it seriously." "You think she's really bad, nurse?" A shade crossed the nurse's face. There was something odd in her voice as she answered, "Yes, I don't quite like her condition. But please don't worry, Sir George. You mustn't. You really mustn't." She gave him a friendly smile and went out. Pamela came in, very languid and cool in her white. "Hello, Nunks." "Hello, Pam, me dear. What have you got there?" "Oh, nice. Well, I'm glad you think so. Do you think your aunt will think so, too? She's incapable of liking anything. I can't think why you married the woman, Nunks." Sir George was silent. A confused panorama of unsuccessful racing, pressing creditors, and a handsome, if domineering woman rose before his mental vision. "Poor old dear," said Pamela. "I suppose you had to do it. But she does give us both rather hell, doesn't she?" "Since she's been ill began Sir George. Pamela interrupted him. "She's not ill. Not really. She can always do anything she wants to. Why, while you were up at Assuan, she was as merry as a cricket. I bet you Miss MacNaughton knows she's a fraud." "I don't know what we'd do without Miss MacNaughton," said Sir George, with a sigh. "She's an efficient creature," admitted Pamela. "I don't exactly dote on her as you do, though, Nunks." "Oh, you do? Don't contradict. You think she's wonderful. So she is, in a way. But she's a dark horse. I never know what she's thinking. Still, she manages the old cat quite well." "Look here, Pam, you mustn't speak of your aunt like that. Dash it all, she's very good to you." "Yes, she pays all our bills, doesn't she? It's the hell of a life, though." Sir George passed on to a less painful subject. "What are we to do about this fellow who's coming on the trip?" "Your aunt wants the boat to herself." "Well, she can't have it," said Pamela coolly. "The man's quite presentable. His name's Parker Pine. I should think he was a civil servant out of the records department, if there is such a thing. Funny thing is, I seem to have heard the name somewhere." "Basil." The secretary had just entered. "Where have I seen the name Parker Pine?" "Front page of the Times." "Agony column," replied the young man promptly. "Are you happy? If not, consult Mr. Parker Pine." "Never." "How frightfully amusing. Let's tell him all our troubles all the way to Cairo." "I haven't any," said Basil West simply. "We're going to glide down the Golden Nile, and see temples dash." He looked quickly at Sir George, who had picked up a paper, "together." The last word was only just breathed, but Pamela caught it. Her eyes met his. "You're right, Basil," she said lightly. "It's good to be alive." Sir George got up and went out. Pamela's face clouded over. "What's the matter, my sweet?" "My detested aunt by marriage don't worry," said Basil quickly. "What does it matter what she gets in her head? Don't contradict her. You see," he laughed, "it's good camouflage." The benevolent figure of Mr. Parker Pine entered the lounge. Behind him came the picturesque figure of Mohammed, prepared to say his piece. "Gentlemen's, we start now. In a few minutes we pass temples of Karnak right-hand side. I tell you story now about little boy who went to buy a roasted lamb for his father." Mr. Parker Pine mopped his forehead. He had just returned from a visit to the temple of Dendera. Riding on a donkey was, he felt, an exercise ill-suited to his figure. He was proceeding to remove his collar when a note propped up on the dressing table caught his attention. He opened it. It ran as follows: "Dear Sir, I should be obliged if you would not visit the Temple of Abydos but would remain on the boat, as I wish to consult you. Yours truly, Ariadne Grail." A smile creased Mr. Parker Pine's large, bland face. He reached for a sheet of paper and unscrewed his fountain pen. "Dear Lady Grail," he wrote, "I am sorry to disappoint you, but I am at present on holiday and am not doing any professional business." He signed his name and dispatched the letter by a steward. As he completed his change of toilet, another note was brought to him. "Dear Mr. Parker Pine, I appreciate the fact that you are on holiday, but I am prepared to pay a fee of £100 for a consultation. Yours truly, Ariadne Grail." Mr. Parker Pine's eyebrows rose. He tapped his teeth thoughtfully with his fountain pen. He wanted to see Abydos, but £100 was £100. And Egypt had been even more wickedly expensive than he had imagined. "Dear Lady Grail," he wrote, "I shall not visit the Temple of Abydos. Yours faithfully, J. Parker Pine." Mr. Parker Pine's refusal to leave the boat was a source of great grief to Mohammed. "Very nice temple. All my gentlemen's like see that temple. I get you carriage. I get you chair, and sailors carry you." Mr. Parker Pine refused all these tempting offers. The others set off. Mr. Parker Pine waited on deck. Presently the door of Lady Grail's cabin opened and the lady herself trailed out on deck. "Such a hot afternoon," she observed graciously. "I see you have stayed behind, Mr. Pine. Very wise of you. Shall we have some tea together in the lounge?" Mr. Parker Pine rose promptly and followed her. It cannot be denied that he was curious. It seemed as though Lady Grail felt some difficulty in coming to the point. She fluttered from this subject to that. But finally she spoke in an altered voice. "Mr. Pine, what I am about to tell you is in the strictest confidence. You do understand that, don't you?" "Naturally." She paused, took a deep breath. Mr. Parker Pine waited. "I want to know whether or not my husband is poisoning me." Whatever Mr. Parker Pine had expected, it was not this. He showed his astonishment plainly. "That is a very serious accusation to make, Lady Grail." "Well, I'm not a fool and I wasn't born yesterday. I've had my suspicions for some time. Whenever George goes away I get better. My food doesn't disagree with me and I feel a different woman. There must be some reason for that. What you say is very serious, Lady Grail. You must remember I am not a detective. I am, if you like to put it that way, a heart specialist dash," she interrupted him. And don't you think it worries me, all this? It's not a policeman I want, I can look after myself, thank you, it's certainty I want. I've got to know. I'm not a wicked woman, Mr. Pine. I act fairly by those who act fairly by me. A bargain's a bargain. I've kept my side of it. I've paid my husband's debts and I've not stinted him in money." Mr. Parker Pine had a fleeting pang of pity for Sir George. "And as for the girl, she's had clothes and parties and this, that and the other. Common gratitude is all I ask." "Gratitude is not a thing that can be produced to order, Lady Grail." "Nonsense," said Lady Grail. She went on. "Well, there it is. Find out the truth for me. Once I know dash," he looked at her curiously. "Once you know, what then, Lady Grail?" "That's my business." Her lips closed sharply. Mr. Parker Pine hesitated a minute, then he said, "You will excuse me, Lady Grail, but I have the impression that you are not being entirely frank with me." "That's absurd. I've told you exactly what I want you to find out." "Yes, but not the reason why." Their eyes met. Hers fell first. "I should think the reason was self-evident," she said. No, because I am in doubt upon one point. What is that? Do you want your suspicions proved right or wrong? Really, Mr. Pine? The lady rose to her feet, quivering with indignation. Mr. Parker Pine nodded his head gently. Yes, yes, he said. But that doesn't answer my question, you know. Oh. Words seemed to fail her. She swept out of the room. Left alone, Mr. Parker Pine became very thoughtful. He was so deep in his own thoughts that he started perceptibly when someone came in and sat down opposite him. It was Miss McNaughton. Surely you're all back very soon, said Mr. Parker Pine. The others aren't back. I said I had a headache and came back alone. She hesitated. Where is Lady Grail? I should imagine lying down in her cabin. Oh, then that's all right. I don't want her to know I've come back. You didn't come back on her account, then? Miss McNaughton shook her head. No, I came back to see you. Mr. Parker Pine was surprised. He would have said offhand that Miss McNaughton was eminently capable of looking after her troubles herself without seeking outside advice. It seemed that he was wrong. I've watched you since we all came on board. I think you're a person of wide experience and good judgment. And I want advice very badly. And yet, excuse me, Miss McNaughton, I think you're not the type that usually seeks advice. I should say that you were a person who was quite content to rely on her own judgment. Normally, yes. But I am in a very peculiar position. She hesitated a moment. I do not usually talk about my cases. But in this instance I think it is necessary. Mr. Pine, when I left England with Lady Grey, she was a straightforward case. In plain language, there was nothing the matter with her. That's not quite true, perhaps. Too much leisure and too much money do produce a definite pathological condition. Having some floors to scrub every day and 5 or 6 children to look after would have made Lady Grail a perfectly healthy and a much happier woman. Mr. Parker Pine nodded. As a hospital nurse, one sees a lot of these nervous cases. Lady Grail enjoyed her bad health. It was my part not to minimize her sufferings, to be as tactful as I could, and to enjoy the trip myself as much as possible. Very sensible, said Mr. Parker Pine. But Mr. Pine, things are not as they were. The suffering that Lady Grail complains of now is real and not imagined. You mean? I have come to suspect that Lady Grail is being poisoned. Since when have you suspected this? For the past 3 weeks. Do you suspect any particular person? Her eyes dropped. For the first time her voice lacked sincerity. No. I put it to you, Miss McNaughton, that you do suspect one particular person, and that person is Sir George Grail. Oh, no, I can't believe it of him. He is so pathetic, so childlike. He couldn't be a cold-blooded poisoner. Her voice had an anguished note in it. And yet you have noticed that whenever Sir George is absent his wife is better, and that her periods of illness correspond with his return. She did not answer. What poison do you suspect? Arsenic? Something of that kind. Arsenic or antimony. And what steps have you taken? I have done my utmost to supervise what Lady Grail eats and drinks. Mr. Parker Pine nodded. Do you think Lady Grail has any suspicion herself? He asked casually. Oh, no, I'm sure she hasn't. There you are wrong, said Mr. Parker Pine. Lady Grail does suspect. Miss McNaughton showed her astonishment. Lady Grail is more capable of keeping a secret than you imagine, said Mr. Parker Pine. She is a woman who knows how to keep her own counsel very well. That surprises me very much, said Miss McNaughton slowly. I should to ask one more question, Miss McNaughton. Do you think Lady Grail likes you? I've never thought about it. They were interrupted. Mohammed came in, his face beaming, his robes flowing behind him. "Lady, she hear you come back, she ask for you. She say why you not come to her?" Elsie MacNaughton rose hurriedly. Mr. Parker Pyne rose also. "Would a consultation early tomorrow morning suit you?" he asked. "Yes, that would be the best time. Lady Grail sleeps late. In the meantime, I shall be very careful. I think Lady Grail will be careful, too." Miss MacNaughton disappeared. Mr. Parker Pyne did not see Lady Grail till just before dinner. She was sitting smoking a cigarette and burning what seemed to be a letter. She took no notice at all of him, by which he gathered that she was still offended. After dinner he played bridge with Sir George, Pamela, and Basil. Everyone seemed a little distrait, and the bridge game broke up early. It was some hours later when Mr. Parker Pyne was roused. It was Mohammed who came to him. "Old lady, she very ill. Nurse, she very frightened. I try get doctor." Mr. Parker Pyne hurried on some clothes. He arrived in the doorway of Lady Grail's cabin at the same time as Basil West. Sir George and Pamela were inside. Elsie MacNaughton was working desperately over her patient. As Mr. Parker Pyne arrived, a final convulsion seized the poor lady. Her arched body writhed and stiffened. Then she fell back on her pillows. Mr. Parker Pyne drew Pamela gently outside. "How awful," the girl was half sobbing. "How awful. Is she dash? Dead?" "Yes, I am afraid it is all over." He put her into Basil's keeping. Sir George came out of the cabin, looking dazed. "I never thought she was really ill," he was muttering. "Never thought it for a moment." Mr. Parker Pyne pushed past him and entered the cabin. Elsie MacNaughton's face was white and drawn. "They have sent for a doctor?" she asked. "Yes." Then he said, "Strychnine?" "Yes." "Those convulsions are unmistakable." "Oh, I can't believe it." She sank into a chair, weeping. He patted her shoulder. Then an idea seemed to strike him. He left the cabin hurriedly and went to the lounge. There was a little scrap of paper left unburnt in an ashtray. Just a few words were distinguishable. "Chet of Dreams burned this." "Now, that's interesting," said Mr. Parker Pyne. Mr. Parker Pyne sat in the room of a prominent official. "So that's the evidence," he said. "Yes, complete. Man must have been a complete idiot. I wouldn't call Sir George a brainy man." The other recapitulated. Lady Grail asks for a cup of soup. The nurse makes it for her. Then she asks for a bit of sherry in it. Sir George produces the sherry. 2 hours later, Lady Grail dies with unmistakable signs of strychnine poisoning. A packet of strychnine is found in Sir George's cabin and another packet actually in the pocket of his dinner jacket. "Very thorough," said Mr. Parker Pyne. "Where did the strychnine come from, by the way?" "There's a little doubt over that. The nurse had some, in case Lady Grail's heart troubled her, but she's contradicted herself once or twice. First she said her supply was intact, and now she says it isn't." "Very unlike her not to be sure," was Mr. Parker Pyne's comment. "They were in it together, in my opinion. They've got a weakness for each other, those two." "Possibly, but if Miss MacNaughton had been planning murder, she'd have done it a good deal better. She's an efficient young woman." "Well, there it is. In my opinion, Sir George is in for it. He hasn't a dog's chance." Well, said Mr. Parker Pyne, "I must see what I can do." He sought out the pretty niece. Pamela was white and indignant. "Nunks never did such a thing, never, never, never." "Then who did?" said Mr. Parker Pyne placidly. Pamela came nearer. "Do you know what I think?" She did it herself. She's been frightfully queer lately. She used to imagine things. What things? Queer things. Basil, for instance. She was always hinting that Basil was in love with her. And Basil and we are I realized that, said Mr. Parker Pine, smiling. All that about Basil was pure imagination. I think she had a down on poor little Nunks, and I think she made up that story and told it to you, and then put the strychnine in his cabin and in his pocket and poisoned herself. People have done things like that, haven't they? They have, admitted Mr. Parker Pine. But I don't think that Lady Grail did. She wasn't, if you'll allow me to say so, the type. But the delusions? Yes, I'd like to ask Mr. West about that. He found the young man in his room. Basil answered his questions readily enough. I don't want to sound fatuous, but she took a fancy to me. That's why I daren't let her know about me and Pamela. She'd have had Sir George fire me. You think Miss Grail's theory a likely one? Well, it's possible, I suppose. The young man was doubtful. But not good enough, said Mr. Parker Pine quietly. No, we must find something better. He became lost in meditation for a minute or two. A confession would be best, he said briskly. He unscrewed his fountain pen and produced a sheet of paper. Just write it out, will you? Basil West stared at him in amazement. Me? What on earth do you mean? My dear young man Mr. Parker Pine sounded almost paternal, I know all about it. How you made love to the good lady. How she had scruples. How you fell in love with the pretty, penniless niece. How you arranged your plot. Slow poisoning. It might pass for natural death from gastroenteritis, if not, it would be laid to Sir George's doing, since you were careful to let the attacks coincide with his presence. Then your discovery that the lady was suspicious and had talked to me about the matter. Quick action. You abstracted some strychnine from Miss Macnaughton's store. Planted some of it in Sir George's cabin, and some in his pocket, and put sufficient into a cachet which you enclosed with a note to the lady, telling her it was a cachet of dreams. A romantic idea. She'd take it as soon as the nurse had left her, and no one would know anything about it. But you made one mistake, my young man. It is useless asking a lady to burn letters. They never do. I've got all that pretty correspondence, including the one about the cachet. Basil West had turned green. All his good looks had vanished. He looked like a trapped rat. Damn you, he snarled. So you know all about it. You damned interfering nosy Parker. Mr. Parker Pine was saved from physical violence by the appearance of the witnesses he had thoughtfully arranged to have listening outside the half-closed door. Mr. Parker Pine was again discussing the case with his friend the high official. And I hadn't a shred of evidence. Only an almost indecipherable fragment with "burn this" on it. I deduced the whole story and tried it on him. It worked. I'd stumbled on the truth. The letters did it. Lady Grail had burned every scrap he wrote, but he didn't know that. She was really a very unusual woman. I was puzzled when she came to me. What she wanted was for me to tell her that her husband was poisoning her. In that case, she meant to go off with young West. But she wanted to act fairly. Curious character. That poor little girl is going to suffer, said the other.